boredom as friction in the attention economy. Attention is not only a personal resource, it is also an interface between a person and a system. Wherever attention goes, behavior tends to follow, and where behavior accumulates, outcomes solidify. Most modern systems that touch attention, tools, platforms, workflows, even ordinary devices, are built with a clear preference. Less waiting, fewer pauses, faster satisfaction. Stimulation is treated as the default mode, and quiet is treated as a defect to be patched. In that environment, boredom looks like wasted capacity. It looks like inefficiency. It looks like a moment that ought to be filled. But the question worth holding is not whether boredom feels pleasant. The question is structural. What function does boredom serve when a system treats every gap as an opportunity for engagement? What does boredom protect? What does it keep intact when stimulation becomes the easiest response to any small discomfort or delay? This is not a nostalgic argument for older habits, and it is not a complaint about new tools. It is an inquiry into constraint and feedback. What is lost when friction is removed, and what is preserved when some friction remains? Boredom protects agency by acting as friction that interrupts stimulation loops and returns attention to choice rather than automatic response. This sermon will examine boredom as a structural phenomenon rather than a mood, and stimulation as a system-level incentive rather than a moral failing. It will not claim that stimulation is inherently harmful, that boredom is inherently good, or that any single practice solves the problem. It will claim only that systems optimized for engagement tend to treat boredom as an error signal to be eliminated, and that eliminating it has second-order effects on what a person can notice, choose, and sustain over time. The goal is clarity about mechanisms, loops, proxies, trade-offs, and the failure modes that appear when optimization outruns reflection. To examine what boredom protects, the terms must be kept plain and operational. Vague language produces vague conclusions. First, attention. Attention is the allocation of limited processing capacity. In ordinary terms, what you notice, what you keep in mind, and what you return to when distracted. Attention has both a directional component, where it points, and a persistence component, how long it stays. A system can influence both by changing what is salient, what is easy, and what is rewarded. Second, stimulation. Stimulation is input engineered or selected to produce immediate engagement. Novelty, motion, sound, alerts, quick rewards, social signals, rapid feedback. Stimulation is not only entertainment, it includes any fast, clear signal that says, something is happening, respond now. A notification is stimulation. A constantly updating feed is stimulation. A tool that provides instant completion indicators is stimulation. Stimulation can be useful. It can also become the default solvent for silence. Third, boredom. Boredom is the felt experience of insufficiently engaging stimulation relative to expectation. It is not simply having nothing to do. A person can be bored while surrounded by options and not bored while doing repetitive work. Boredom arises when the mind predicts that continued attention to the present object will not pay off. In that sense, boredom is an evaluative signal. This is not rewarding enough. But boredom is not only a private feeling, it is also a point of friction in a loop. When a system supplies stimulation on demand, boredom becomes the moment that triggers switching, the pivot where attention moves away. When a system does not supply stimulation, boredom becomes a pause where other signals can appear. Hunger, fatigue, curiosity, worry, longing, the perception of time passing, the memory of obligations, the sense of an unfinished thought. Fourth, agency. Agency is the capacity to choose among options based on reasons that remain stable across short-term fluctuations. It includes the ability to delay response, to sustain a task without constant novelty, and to decline an available stimulus. Agency is not absolute freedom. It is constrained choice. It is the ability to be governed by more than the nearest cue. Now, a necessary distinction. Metric versus meaning. A metric is a measurable proxy. Minutes spent, clicks, opens, streaks, completion rates, engagement frequency, responsiveness. Metrics are attractive because they are legible to machines and comparable across users. Meaning is what those metrics stand in for. Understanding, trust, competence, relationship, rest, insight, craftsmanship, responsibility. Meaning is harder to measure and easier to substitute. When a system optimizes a metric, it does not optimize meaning directly. It optimizes the proxy. Sometimes the proxy tracks meaning well, Often it drifts. Assumptions should be explicit. Assumption 1, attention is finite and competes with itself. Allocating attention to one thing reduces what is available for other things. Assumption 2, people adapt to the environment. If stimulation is cheap and constant, expectations shift upward. What used to be enough engagement becomes not enough. Boredom becomes more frequent, not because the world is emptier, but because the baseline has moved. Assumption 3, systems do not need malice to shape behavior. Incentives and feedback loops are sufficient. With these terms in place, the core question becomes sharper. In a stimulation-rich environment, boredom is treated as a defect, an error signal to be resolved quickly by switching, scrolling, refreshing, checking, sampling. But if boredom is also friction, then it may protect something by slowing the switch and forcing contact with what stimulation would otherwise mask. What could that be? It could be the ability to stay with an experience long enough for deeper rewards to emerge. It could be the recognition of one's own needs before they are drowned out. It could be the capacity to generate intention rather than merely respond. This is the structure we are examining, boredom as an internal constraint that, under certain conditions, preserves agency by resisting immediate substitution. A system built for stimulation contains a paradox. It promises freedom through options, yet it often reduces freedom through automation of choice. The promise is simple: more content, more tools, more personalization, more recommendations. The system claims to remove friction and deliver what you want faster. The user is framed as sovereign, selecting from an abundant menu. But the mechanism often works in the opposite direction. To maximize engagement, the system must minimize the moments when the user might stop. As a failure state, it must convert pauses into prompts. This is where boredom becomes politically neutral but structurally contentious. Boredom is a pause that might lead to stopping, reflecting, or changing direction. For a system measured by continued interaction, boredom is not a human signal to be interpreted. It is a threat to the metric. The tension can be stated as proxy versus reality. The proxy, time on task, daily actives, retention, responsiveness, frequency. These are legible, they can be optimized. The reality, whether the attention spent produced understanding, competence, durable satisfaction, or merely consumption. Whether the user feels more capable at the end of the day, or simply more occupied. Optimization prefers what can be measured. Meaning prefers what can be lived. Now consider the feedback loop. 1. The system supplies stimulation. 2. The user's boredom threshold rises because the system trains expectation toward constant novelty and reward. 3. Increased boredom produces more switching. 4. More switching creates more signals for the system to learn from. 5. The system improves its ability to deliver immediate engagement. This loop can be experienced as personalization and convenience. It can also be experienced as reduced tolerance for quiet, reduced persistence, and a weakened ability to choose a slower reward over a fast one. A key failure mode at the individual level is reactive substitution. Reactive substitution is the pattern where any small discomfort, waiting, uncertainty, effort, ambiguity, automatically triggers a substitution of stimulus. The person does not decide, I will change tasks for a reason. The person is moved by the cue. The immediate stimulus becomes a universal solvent for discomfort. The cost is not only lost minutes, the cost is the erosion of a specific capacity to remain present when the reward is delayed or unclear. Many valuable activities have delayed or subtle returns. Reading carefully, thinking through a problem, practicing a skill, repairing a relationship, completing an obligation, resting without entertainment. These require the ability to withstand low stimulation without immediately switching. A second failure mode at the individual level is attention fragmentation. Fragmentation occurs when attention is repeatedly split into small segments by frequent context switching. The system may call this multitasking, productivity, staying informed, staying connected. The mind experiences it as a series of half entries and half exits. Over time, fragmentation can reduce the availability of deep focus, not by eliminating desire for it, but by making it harder to initiate and sustain. The paradox intensifies because stimulation is not only pleasurable, it is also a safety mechanism. Uncertainty is uncomfortable. Boredom exposes uncertainty. A quick stimulus provides a predictable feeling. Something is happening. I am responding. I am not stuck. So stimulation becomes a kind of cognitive insurance policy. At the system level, there are failure modes that do not require anyone to intend harm. One system-level failure mode is engagement maximization as moral neutrality. When a system treats engagement as the primary metric, it must remain indifferent to why engagement occurs. Interest, anxiety, outrage, curiosity, loneliness, habit all become equivalent if they sustain interaction. The system does not need to believe anything about what is good for the user. It only needs to measure what keeps the loop running. This is not an accusation. It is a description of incentives. The system behaves as designed. Another system-level failure mode is friction elimination as a universal good. Removing friction often improves usability. It reduces errors and saves time. Yet friction is not only waste. Some friction is protective. Speed limits, confirmation steps, cooling off periods, deliberate pacing in education, thresholds that prevent impulsive changes. When friction is treated as inherently bad, the system can remove not only inefficiency, but also safeguards. Boredom belongs to this category. It is friction in the flow of stimulation. It is a delay that prevents instant substitution. It can feel like a bug, but it may be a safeguard. The paradox, then, is optimization versus meaning. Optimization seeks continuous improvement on a metric. Meaning requires discontinuities, rest, silence, stopping, the acceptance of enough, the capacity to choose less stimulation even when more is available. A system cannot easily optimize for enough because enough ends the session. It ends the measurable interaction. So the system has an incentive to treat enough as a temporary state to be escaped. Boredom in a stimulation system is the moment enough might occur. It is the hinge between continuing and stopping. If boredom is quickly resolved by a new stimulus, the hinge is bypassed. If boredom is allowed to persist, the hinge remains functional. This is the tension that will not resolve cleanly. The same mechanisms that provide convenience and access also train expectation, raise baseline stimulation needs, and make agency more expensive. The system offers freedom of choice while quietly reducing the likelihood of certain kinds of choices, especially the choice to endure low stimulation in service of longer-term meaning. Boredom sits at the boundary. It can be experienced as emptiness, but it can also be a signal that the loop has paused and that other forms of guidance might be heard. Second-order effects matter because they persist even when individuals believe they are choosing freely, and even when designers believe they are improving experience. The second-order effect is not an accidental side note. It is the long-run pattern that emerges after adaptation. Consider first the second-order effect on time perception. In high-stimulation environments, time is partitioned into small, immediately rewarded units. The day becomes a sequence of nexts. When stimulation is continuous, the mind is rarely asked to feel duration without reward. Boredom, by contrast, makes duration visible. It reveals time as a constraint. That revelation can be unpleasant, but it also anchors planning, patience, and the recognition that some outcomes require extended effort. When boredom is always solved by stimulation, duration becomes harder to tolerate. Tasks that require waiting or slow accumulation, learning, repair, careful work, feel increasingly unacceptable, not because they are worse, but because the comparative baseline has shifted. Second, consider the effect on preference formation. Preferences are not only discovered, they are shaped by exposure and reinforcement. When a system supplies immediate novelty, it can train the user toward novelty seeking as a default. Over time, "I like this" may partly mean this is easy to consume and quickly rewarding. Boredom disrupts this training. It is a moment where the system is not providing reinforcement. In that gap, a person might notice the difference between "this feels good now" and "this matters later." Without the gap, the distinction can become theoretical rather than lived. Third, consider the effect on self-knowledge. Many internal signals are subtle. Fatigue often announces itself quietly before it becomes collapse. Curiosity can be faint before it becomes obsession. Concern can be diffuse before it becomes anxiety. When stimulation is constant, subtle signals can be outcompeted. The strongest cue wins. Boredom can act as a low-noise interval where these signals become legible. Not because boredom is insightful in itself, but because boredom reduces competition for attention. It protects a kind of internal bandwidth. Fourth, consider social second-order effects. In a system where responsiveness is visible and measurable, seen read receipts, rapid replies, constant availability, stimulation merges with social obligation. Quick attention becomes a sign of care. Slow attention becomes suspect. This changes norms. People begin to experience any pause as neglect, and they begin to use stimulation as a substitute for presence. Frequent small signals rather than sustained engagement. The trade-off is not necessarily less connection, but different connection, more frequent, less deep, more reactive, less deliberate. Boredom in this context protects the possibility of unstructured time that is not immediately filled with performative responsiveness. It preserves room for interactions that are not optimized for speed. Fifth, consider the labor of decision-making. When stimulation is abundant, the number of potential choices increases, yet more options do not always produce more agency. Often they produce decision fatigue. To reduce fatigue, people rely on defaults. Systems supply defaults. The combination creates a predictable path, the path of least resistance. In such a landscape, boredom has an unexpected role. It can interrupt default following. It is the point where the default stops working momentarily. That interruption can be the only moment when an alternative becomes thinkable. Now, why do these effects persist? They persist because they are reinforced by incentives on both sides. For users, stimulation is low-cost relief. It reduces discomfort quickly. The immediate reward is real. For systems, stimulation produces measurable engagement. It improves the metrics that justify the system's existence and funding. The improvement is also real within the metric. These incentives create a stable equilibrium, quick relief for the user, good numbers for the system, and gradual erosion of capacities that are not measured. This is a trade-off, not a conspiracy, but it is a trade-off with asymmetry. What is gained is immediate and visible. What is lost is slow and often invisible until it becomes consequential. The losses take forms that are easy to misattribute. A person may interpret reduced patience as a personal flaw rather than an adaptation to high novelty. A person may interpret inability to focus as lack of discipline rather than the predictable result of repeated interruptions. A person may interpret constant checking as curiosity rather than reactive substitution. Meanwhile, the system interprets the same behaviors as success, high engagement, strong retention, frequent return. Boredom complicates this equilibrium because it is a symptom that the system is not currently rewarding attention. If boredom is immediately treated as a problem to be solved by more stimulation, the equilibrium remains stable. If boredom is allowed to exist, even briefly, it reintroduces ambiguity. Perhaps the problem is not the content, but the loop. Still, boredom is not a pure good. It has its own trade-offs. Boredom can lead to aimless seeking, not reflective choice. Boredom can be used as justification for harmful substitutions. Boredom can be intolerable in contexts where a person has limited autonomy. So the claim is not that boredom should be maximized. The claim is that boredom, as friction, protects certain capacities that stimulation systems tend to discount. Persistence, internal signal detection, tolerance for delayed reward, and the ability to stop. In a world optimized for continuous engagement, the ability to stop is not a personality trait. It is a structural achievement. Boredom contributes to that achievement by making the stopping point perceptible. What does boredom protect in a system built for stimulation? A disciplined answer does not need to romanticize boredom. It only needs to notice what boredom makes possible. Boredom protects the gap between impulse and response. That gap is where agency resides. When stimulation is always available, the gap collapses. The person becomes efficient at switching, efficient at consuming, efficient at escaping minor discomfort. Efficiency reveals values, but it can also reveal a narrowness of value, the value of never being without a cue. Boredom also protects contact with non-optimized goods. Some goods do not scale and do not advertise themselves well. Quiet competence, slow understanding, durable relationships, rest that is not entertainment, work done without applause, thought that does not immediately publish. A system tuned for stimulation can unintentionally teach that these goods are not engaging enough, which is another way of saying not profitable enough or not measurable enough. The user may then internalize the system's preference and call it their own. And yet, stimulation is not an enemy. Many forms of stimulation are educational, connective, and liberating. The failure mode is not stimulation, it is the unexamined coupling of stimulation to every moment of friction. So the unresolved tension remains. Boredom can be both signal and noise. It can signal misalignment, an activity that no longer matters, It can signal withdrawal, an expectation trained so high that ordinary reality cannot compete. It can be a prompt to change direction. It can be a prompt to endure and go deeper. No external system can fully distinguish these cases for a person, because the distinction is not purely behavioral. It depends on meaning, and meaning is not fully legible to metrics. Clarity, then, comes from examining constraints and incentives rather than seeking a universal rule. If boredom is always followed by stimulation, the system's loop strengthens. If boredom is sometimes allowed to remain, other feedback loops can appear. Reflection, planning, memory consolidation, the slow return of curiosity, the recognition that some discomfort is informational. This is not a call to embrace boredom as a virtue. It is a request for accurate naming. Boredom is not only a nuisance to eliminate, it is friction that sometimes prevents a faster failure. The unresolved point is deliberate. A person cannot outsource the meaning of their attention to a system that is rewarded for keeping attention regardless of meaning. The system can optimize for engagement, it cannot optimize for enough. Boredom, when it appears, is evidence of that boundary. Whether boredom protects you or merely irritates you depends on what you do with the gap. That is a question of agency under constraint, and it does not admit a clean ending.